It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Amanda Poole. Dr. Poole is an environmental anthropologist with international and domestic research experience on community-based resource management. Dr. Poole received her bachelor's degree in English and Comparative Cultures at Alfred University, and she received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington. Her dissertation was entitled The Power of Place, Refugee Resettlement, Resource Management, and State Making in Lowlands Eritrea, and is based on her extensive fieldwork in Eritrea, supported by the Social Science Research Council and other fellowships. She started her international interest when she served as a Peace Corps teacher from 1997 to 1998 in Eritrea. She got evacuated, and she'll probably talk a little bit more about that. She then returned for a second Peace Corps stint as a teacher in 2000 for 2 years, and a teacher trainer with the Peace Corps in Namibia. In 2004, she was a visiting lecturer at the University of Asmara. She's also done work in Appalachia, and since 2012 to the present, she's served on the Appalachia Teaching Project, doing research on sustainable development. At Indiana University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Poole teaches courses on Africa, applied anthropology, ecological anthropology, and cultural theories. She has taught in both academic and applied settings, including serving as a consultant and field researcher with NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Project. She's published numerous publications, and she is a member of the American Anthropologic Association, the African Studies Association, and the Honor Society of Phi Kappa Phi, including many others. Her resume is probably 5 pages long. I looked it up. Her fields of specialization include political ecology, ethnoecology, community-based resource management, rural and post-conflict development, food sovereignty, forced migration and refugees study, and the anthropology of the state. And in Northern Appalachia, she's been working on the social dynamics around hydraulic fracturing. Her presentation tonight will discuss her 2 decades of research in Eritrea and Ethiopia on rural development, forced migration, and refugee policy. Following the presentation, Dr. Poole would be happy to take your questions. So please allow me to turn the podium over to Dr. Poole for her program, There Is No Future Here, Refugee Education and Forced Migration in Northern Ethiopia. Dr. Poole, welcome.
So thank you so much for that great introduction and the generous invitation to speak here today. So I'll be sharing some of my findings from more recent ethnographic research that I conducted with my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Riggin of Arcadia University. And I want to set the stage for you and begin with an encounter that we had with a young Eritrean man during one of our first visits to the Eritrean refugee camps in northern Ethiopia. So I'll call him Haptom. We met Haptom in a tent that he shared with 7 other young men. He had fled to Ethiopia from Eritrea with the intent to move on from there, eventually reaching Europe. Haptom knew full well that the risks of northward migration, right, through Ethiopia, up through the Horn of Africa, to and across the Mediterranean, that those risks included falling into the hands of human traffickers, that could involve torture, slavery, or even death. What he didn't count on was the possibility of staying in Ethiopia. When he arrived at the refugee camp, he was drawn into these programs designed to slow this onward migration. He worked for a small stipend for an aid organization in the camps. He volunteered as a teacher, and he even took a class that prepared him to take the college matriculation exam, and he passed it. So he earned a full scholarship to go to college in Ethiopia. But despite all of these opportunities, he was haunted by the thought that he might be stuck, falling into what he described as the empty time of the camp. It was a decision that he was really struggling with. And at the end of the interview, he turned to us and he said, "My dream is so many things. What should I do?" He effectively seeking our input into how to make his future. Several months later, Habtom left Ethiopia. His story is not unique. Eritrean refugees have for many years now been one of the largest groups of migrants attempting to reach Europe. Much of this through irregular migration, right? So that's migration outside of official channels. And these irregular routes involve the risk of falling into the hands of human traffickers. Many of these young people were passing through Ethiopia, where they encountered the rollout of educational opportunities and development programs designed to encourage them to stay there. In fact, when we began our fieldwork in 2016, it was a really optimistic time. Ethiopia was taking the lead on new and collaborative policies designed to help refugees and deter irregular migration. So do these policies work? Why do so many refugees engage in irregular migration despite the grave risks and the presence of programs intended to stop them from migrating? We set out to look at this question from the vantage point of refugees. So today, I'm going to give you some background on Eritrea and Ethiopia. I know Ethiopia seems very far away, but these refugees and hosting countries are part of a global political and economic system that touches on our lives here, and certainly our policies here affect their lives. I'll talk a little bit about how we did this research and why we use anthropology to look at refugee education, and then I'll share some of our findings. When we talk to refugees that are the targets of these programs, they described their concerns and their dilemmas, their analyses, and their creative problem solving, or the agency that they claimed under extremely challenging circumstances. And when they did this, they didn't really focus on the place where they were living, or even specific places in Europe or the US where they hoped to end up. They tended to focus on their experiences of time. Habtom's description of the empty, stuck time of the camp is just one of the temporalities that refugees experienced and described to us, but there are many more. And when I talk about temporality, I'm referring to the ways in which we culturally experience and make meaning of time. For example, when I go to Ethiopia, I often not only get lost wandering around, especially in the capital city, like I don't know where I am, but I often don't know when I am. People start counting the hours from dawn often. So you'll get in a taxi at 8 a.m. and it says it's 2 o'clock. Right now, the year in Ethiopia, according to the Ethiopian calendar, I think it's 2015, yeah. And there are 13 months of the year. But beyond this different way of counting time, I think we can all relate to the experience of time moving differently, right? Like rushing by us when we're super busy, like finals week or the end of the semester, moving painfully slowly, like sitting through a really long lecture at 8 at night somewhere. We've all been there. So this focus on time, I'm going to argue, it opens up really important insights about refugee education in the global South and why it isn't always working the way it's supposed to. When we focus on time, we can better appreciate why refugee youth might forego a college scholarship or other educational opportunities while they either remain in the camp or they risk their lives to move on. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the recent war in Tigray. that broke out shortly after we finished our research and what that means for Eritrean refugees today. So we often think about the migrant crisis as happening at the borders of Europe or the US. But the vast majority of displaced people remain in their region of origin. So that really opens up the question, like, who is this a crisis for? Ethiopia hosts around 900,000 refugees, and it's one of the largest refugee hosting countries in the world. During the time of our fieldwork, Ethiopia was actively positioning itself as a leader in emerging global policy initiatives that were attempting to secure the borders of the global north by containing refugees in the global south and changing the nature of refugee hosting in these countries in the global south. So when I talk about the global north, I'm referring to, what are thought of as these economically developed regions like the US or Europe, and the global south is often thought of as developing, right? When we began our research in 2016, Ethiopia was taking center stage as a co-host, with the United States in New York City. And this was of a leaders' summit on refugees and migrants. The UN General Assembly had called for a summit of world leaders in an effort at more global coordination around migration management. And this was in part a response to the scale of displacement, right, which has been increasing every year globally. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, estimates that there are around 100 million displaced people as of early this year. To this end, the 2016 Refugee Summit focused on changing the nature of refugee hosting in places like Ethiopia with support from wealthy donor nations. The summit led to a global compact, and this global compact joined an emerging series of policy efforts, all of them designed to stem that flow of migration to the global north. And this was a major shift in global refugee management migration policy because it switched the focus to local integration as the durable solution, right? Protracted conflicts mean that people can't often safely return to their home countries from where they were displaced. And that's thought of usually as the first durable solution, repatriation. Less than 1% of refugees are ever resettled to countries like the US through formal programs. So that's thought of as the second durable solution, right? Resettlement or repatriation. So in these situations of protracted displacement, where people may live decades in refugee camps, the other option for a durable solution is increasingly thought of as local integration into these hosting states. Refugee scholars detail the rationale for this policy shift as a kind of economic solution to a failing system of global refugee management, one that would potentially restore refugees' autonomy through jobs and education by incentivizing investment from wealthy nations into haven countries like Ethiopia, where refugees could be folded into the workforce as laborers and entrepreneurs. And this is really sort of shifting how refugees are talked about and thought about from humanitarian victims in need of aid to the objects of development, right? Economic actors. Other scholars call this a kind of humanitarian border work because it keeps refugees away from the borders of the global north, but ostensibly does so in ways that kind of safeguard their lives and give them these opportunities to get education and to work. And it's really important to point out, though, that while these policies may stress these benefits for refugees, there are others benefiting from this. Ethiopia was gaining funding and status from playing this role of a hosting state, and countries in the global north, they're offshoring their border work, right? Far from the actual borders of Europe. Okay. So Ethiopia has really had a policy of encampment for much of its history. That means they're hosting all these refugees from neighboring countries, but they're doing so within refugee camps. And for Eritreans, the first of 6 camps that were set up to host Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, that was built in 2004. And so some people that we encountered and we spoke to in 2016, they'd been living there for more than a decade when we first met them. Even so, when my colleague and I met with Ethiopian officials, we consistently heard the claim that within the next 10 years, there would be no refugee camps in Ethiopia. They were moving towards this policy of local integration, building on earlier efforts, which included that refugee college scholarship program, and an out-of-camp program that for refugees who had local sponsorship and could demonstrate they had the resources to live outside the camp, and they were permitted to do so. Okay, so at that New York summit, Ethiopia made 9 pledges. Many of them were oriented towards ending camp-based care by promoting local integration, with that goal of making life for refugees in Ethiopia more viable. That included things like expanding the out-of-camp program, making work permits available to some refugees, creating jobs in industrial parks, and making land available. These pledges also promised to enhance social services like education and provide documentation to refugees, birth and marriage certificates, driver's licenses, even bank accounts. People were really excited about these pledges. But for the most part, during the years of our fieldwork, between 2016 and through 2019, up until 2019, they did not materialize. Refugees in Ethiopia could not work legally or open a business legally, travel freely, or pursue a graduate degree. Their status as non-citizens placed them in subordinate positions. People knew all about the pledges. They talked about them. Every return visit, refugees were growing increasingly weary of waiting, and they began to see these pledges as empty promises, being dangled there to keep them waiting in Ethiopia. So in January 2019, the Ethiopian parliament did vote to ratify a revised refugee proclamation, and it was expected to give refugees greater freedom of movement and to work, but the implementation timeline is still unspecified. Okay. Eritrean refugees, in particular, have been at the vanguard of these policy initiatives because of the complex history between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and because of the large numbers of Eritreans attempting to migrate to Europe. There were around 170,000 Eritrean refugees hosted in Ethiopia during our fieldwork, but at any given time, as we were told by an aid worker, it might not be the same population of people. They were on the move. Eritreans had been fleeing their country since a border conflict erupted with Ethiopia in 1998, just a few years after Eritrea gained its independence from Ethiopia through a long and hard-fought struggle. And I was actually serving as a Peace Corps volunteer there at the time, and we were evacuated in 1998. This map here shows something of the long contested border. So I was actually serving right near that town of Sorona, right near the border. Many young people flee Eritrea every year. It's a militarized authoritarian state without democratic elections, independent civil society organizations, or independent judiciary. The provisional constitution hasn't been implemented, and Eritrean people may be arbitrarily arrested and detained for all kinds of reasons. Like, for example, practicing a religion that's not one of the 4 officially sanctioned religions. And that's in a prison system where harsh abuse is routine. So, for example, for most of the last 20 years, movement within the country requires written permission. So for me to come give a talk here, right, I have to ask for permission and get official travel documents to come here and give a talk. It's also illegal to leave the country without an exit visa, which has been very hard to get. The thousands who flee Eritrea each month risk being shot or imprisoned. A lot of young people leave. And in many cases, children, before they are conscripted into military service. So we have some high schoolers here, right? That happens in secondary school. So to finish high school in grade 12, you're required to do it at SAWA, which is a military training camp, and it serves as a kind of pipeline into the military. And life in the military is harsh. There is a law requiring citizens to do 18 months of national military service. But because of this protracted border conflict with Ethiopia, that's extended pretty much indefinitely. And conditions for soldiers in the military, they include forced punishments and, physical punishments and forced labor, and also additional restrictions on freedom of movement or time with your family. So a lot of the Eritreans who leave are young, they're of school age, and many are unaccompanied minors. So it means that they cross the border and they don't have family there to care for them. We were talking a little bit with the high school students about anthropology, right? And I'm a cultural anthropologist. So we study people, but we're not really studying people so much as we're learning from them. And we really value that ground up view of the world that you don't get easily from other kinds of research. If we want to understand how huge shifts in global migration policy are actually working, you can't do that without talking to the people who are the targets of these policies, are hugely impacted by them, and they're often missing from the room when these policies are designed in the first place. So here's an example of how anthropology research can show us those blind spots, right, that often exist in places where there's a lot of inequality. On one of our later visits to the camp, in 2018, we were drinking Coca-Cola with our interviewee, Futsum, at a bar along the main regional road that runs straight through the refugee camp. So it's a pretty busy road. It goes straight through the camp. And Futsum was a camp leader. He'd lived there for nearly a decade. He typically would fill us in every visit on how not much had changed, right? They're still waiting for the pledges. They're pretty skeptical that the pledges are going to make their lives better, but there's some hope there. And as we wrapped up our conversation, Futsum, he pointed to this busy road in front of us and he said, one thing has changed. Do you notice anything? And a large bus was lumbering along the road, and it comes up to this speed bump, this massive speed bump that's so big it kind of has to go off the side of the road so only one tire goes over it. And we thought, oh yeah, there's speed bumps. He told us about these years of refugee effort to get these speed bumps installed on this busy road right through camp, and how it finally happened after a child was killed in traffic. So we can learn from the ground up view of these speed bumps, right? From the vantage point of Futsum. They are this physical reminder of refugees' struggles to insert their needs into the conversation about things that affect them, but also that the people who create and implement policy designed to protect refugees, they often remain oblivious to their real needs, and people die as a result of that. There is also a temporal dimension to this. Humanitarian time of aid to refugees from these national and international organizations, it's really sluggish. It seems like nothing happens and people feel stuck. But it also operates as a technology of power. It differentiates the people who set things in motion from the people who are made to wait. And it prioritizes humanitarian policy and timelines that are established elsewhere, far from the camp. We can also see that in this sign here, one of the many that existed in the Hatsats refugee camp. This is a sign that's sort of branding the latrine behind it, the corrugated iron latrine. It's sort of giving credit to all these organizations for building the latrine. I know the picture's a little bit small, but maybe the people in the front might notice something kind of interesting about the sign or curious about it. No? So there's all these aid organization kind of logos, and it's telling us that those latrines were built by them at this camp. So I would say it's all in English, right? This is a refugee camp where most people are not speaking English. They're speaking Tigrinya. So it's another kind of example of that, right? And here's another picture here. This is a brand new secondary school that was built in the camp where I interviewed Hoptome. It opened late in our field work. And they had this beautiful, big new resource library that was filled with computers. They were all stacked in boxes, and not a single one of them was being used. And they were having trouble recruiting students to come to the school, right? They had all these classroom seats that are empty. Why are the computer boxes sitting unused in this new resource room? Any guesses? So maybe they're lacking people who know how to use them.
English, wrong voltage.
There's actually no electricity at all. Nor is there running water. So the idea that this looks good from the donors end of things, let's send these really nice computers to this refugee camp, but what are the real needs on the ground? Okay. So our project kind of moves between these different sites. Policy centers like the capital city, regional refugee management offices, and 3 of the refugee camps in the north of Ethiopia near that Eritrean border. We wanted to explore what is the lived experience of these policies that are designed to care for and educate these young refugees and encourage them to stay in Ethiopia. So we did a lot of our work in and around schools, classroom observations and interviews, and moving across these multiple places was important, but so was that kind of long-term relationship building. So in between our visits, we would keep in touch with people through social media. I don't know, why would anthropologists be interested in schools? They are fascinating. Schools are places where culture is learned and taught, right? Like values and norms and mental maps of the world. What people are in society, what our capabilities might be. They can reproduce social structures, social inequalities, or challenge them. They're also places where people connect with the state, the nation state. So if we think about refugee youth, in many places, half of refugees living there are under the age of 18. Education is not just a human right. For refugee youth, there's lots of research on how important it can be, that schools can be for their safety and their well-being. Schooling provides protection from exploitation, forced labor, forced recruitment into armed groups, so it's super important. And a lot of the literature on refugee education tends to focus on these questions of access and of quality. Those are so important. The UNHCR estimates that nearly half of refugee children, that's millions of children, right, are unable to attend school. But there's also more going on than just issues of access. Too few of these studies look at what education actually means to refugees themselves. And that's where anthropology steps in. They just presume that education is an unqualified, a simple good. We found that it was a much more complicated story. So I told you about Hoptome, who was describing his decision to give up that college scholarship, right? Across the levels of schooling, we found there were similar challenges in retaining refugee youth in school seats. In a different camp, near to where we interviewed Hoptome, we got a tour from the director of the secondary school in the camp. It had been built around 8 years ago, shortly after the camp opened. He was really proud of the facilities, right? The trained teachers, the library, and the mission. The signs at the school above his office and in the school compound, they read, "The future is in school today, and education is the only powerful weapon to change the world." So taken together, these statements link the school with the present and the future, and this vision of changing the world, and reflects a powerful faith that education is a path to progress, right? This is the tool you need to get ahead. But a chart on the wall told a different story. So that chart here is of enrollment rates at the school, and it showed that for refugee students, they were declining. So they were increasing for local students, but going down for refugee students over the years. And, at other schools, like that new secondary school, the primary schools, they were thinly enrolled. Why, if schooling had such positive connotations, were there not more refugees in school? And when you walk through the camps, right, they're filled with school-age children. The schools were there. This wasn't just an access issue. We learned through our work that to understand the empty school seats, we had to look at the temporality of schooling. And when we did that, the idea that education is a powerful weapon came to take on a new meaning. Okay. The Refugee College Scholarship Program is a really good way to think about some of these contradictions. So in our book, that's hopefully coming out this year, we kind of look at all of these different levels of education, but here I'll focus in on that college level. One of our interviewees, Barry Hu, he had graduated at the top of his class from a college in Ethiopia 2 years before we met him. I mean, he just did a really great job. Super smart student, worked extremely hard. But then he found himself back in the camp because he couldn't get a work visa, right? There weren't work visas for refugees, and he didn't have resources to support himself outside of the camp. Like many of the college graduates, he found himself in the camp, and so he kept busy. He was volunteering to teach in the primary school. And he did that for a small stipend of about $40 a month. So for refugees, since they can't make a salary, there's a kind of capped stipend that they can work for aid organizations and earn. He knew he should feel dedicated to inspiring children, but he found it discouraging. He also faced the challenges of life in the camp. Most importantly, he couldn't see a future for himself. At one point, he described to us about how he found himself floundering. He showed up late. He forgot to bathe, and he dressed in a manner that's not really appropriate for a teacher. He told us he suffered from a sense of purposelessness. And to fight against that, he took out a loan to start a business, a small cafe, and he dug out a garden in the rocky land attached to his house. And, there were some incredibly large boulders that he relocated to plant some crops. And even though he was told by camp administration that he didn't actually have permission to do that, ultimately, he faced a situation in which he was forced to choose between trying to help himself, focusing on his business and surviving day to day, or help others in his community, something that he should be able to do as an educated person that people looked up to. His business did fail when the generator died, so he couldn't keep drinks cold. In fact, there were so many activities that he and other refugees like Barry Hu engaged in the camp to care for themselves and for each other, knowing that these activities were only temporary. They were ways of passing the time in what they described as the endless present of the camp, a temporality where people felt stuck and unable to work towards a desired future. So his struggles were shared with other refugees, especially college graduates. In a focus group at his house one evening, these graduates who were back in the camp after graduation, they linked their suffering to schooling. They described education as a kind of double-edged sword, having all the potential to change the world in positive ways, but often causing harm to refugees instead. In our research, we heard repeatedly about that harm. If you teach someone that going out in the sun is harmful, and then you send them out without shelter, better to never know the sun is bad. Another explained, 4 years ago I graduated. I have an asset. But if you have a big asset and you can't use it, it's like a virus, right? It'll drive you crazy. Graduates who had been back in the camp for as many as 7 years after completing their degrees in Ethiopia, they likened their education to a punishment and a poison, reflecting on how they may have been at the top of their class. They now worked for a small stipend in the camp, stagnating, while Ethiopian colleagues advanced their careers, in some cases performing the same job for an actual salary. So the education program that was designed to be integrative actually produced exclusion at the local level and reinforced the notion that Eritreans don't truly belong there. This also takes shape at a global level. Many of the young men who had graduated and served as these kind of volunteer incentive workers, they felt they were less visible to aid organizations and less of a priority for resettlement because they weren't as immediately vulnerable, right? Indeed, one man observed that the Ethiopian government and the UNHCR, the people who ran the camps, right, they benefited keeping these graduates in the camps because they were doing all this unpaid work. Well, there's a sense that promises have not been fulfilled. Another regret comes from this internalized blame for wasting years in pursuit of that empty promise. Berryhu mused, we went to school, we followed the classes for 20 years, so we blame ourselves. Like, why did I do that? What's going on here, we argue, is not only a sense that the promises of education have failed, it's what we call a violence that's done by the temporality of education, the teleological temporality, when it meets with the structural and symbolic barriers faced by refugees. So teleology is a kind of time where there's an endpoint, right, or a goal. So things are all moving towards that goal. But what if you learn what you're supposed to succeed, you recognize your own potential, and you aspire to that progress, but you also know that you can't get there? So schools kind of produce this teleological time. If you think about it, they're structured according to this model of really scheduled time in increments, where these small increments of a period connect to these ever larger increments, the day, the week, the semester, the year, each of which has a kind of assessment and that rewards accrue based on how well you do, sticking to that timeline. They teach students to keep time, to use time in particular ways, and progress is assessed on how well you do that. Schools in the refugee camps are no exception. Students were expected to be on time, despite the fact that humanitarian aid was structured without any regard for the time of refugees. They were typically left to wait long and unpredictable hours for rations, water, services. In fact, the assumption was just that their time wasn't valuable. They had all the time in the world, and they were often forced to miss school waiting for these things. That teleological nature of education has a kind of morality attached to it that involves a sense of individual responsibility for progress. Anthropologist Daniel Maines notes, the educated individual expects to be transformed so that their future will be better than the present. Someone who's temporally disciplined and uses their time well is supposed to be successful, right? The teleological violence experienced by refugees operates on several registers. People hold contradictory ideas that they can get ahead if they work hard and discipline themselves. And they're also aware that there are real barriers that will likely make getting ahead impossible. The logics of progress through self-discipline confront the realities of structural barriers to achieving goals. And teleological time shifts the blame for lack of progress towards those refugees and their decision-making and their use of time. Teleological violence also involves the ways in which education can prevent integration and stigmatize refugees. And that works in a few ways. So, for example, we heard the frequent observation from college students, refugee college students, that despite hard work and success, refugee students were regularly passed up for recognition and opportunities. Stories also abounded about the ways in which the slow and impersonal bureaucracy of humanitarian aid made refugee students feel othered and not cared for. They were sent to universities a month after classes began. They didn't have access to the programs they wanted to be in. They didn't get enough resources to afford basic supplies, like the photocopies they needed of the readings. At one university, the shower block was broken, so students had to pay for showers in the town, and the refugee students didn't have money to do that, so they couldn't even bathe. So there's another way that education leads to stigma, While schools can imbue someone with the status of being an educated person, that status that should be a kind of cultural capital, right, or a resource that brings you standing and social recognition, can also be experienced as stigmatizing. When refugees do everything they're supposed to do to succeed and adapt to the strict teleological discipline of education, only to find themselves stuck once more, unable to work legally, advance professionally, assume the responsibilities of adulthood, they see themselves as negative role models for children in the camps, examples of that empty promise of teleological time. When we're talking about violence, we're often referring to the kinds of things that cause direct harm to people. We think about that as direct physical violence, like the violence directed against refugees and civilians in the region after the war broke out in 2020. But harm can also be caused by institutions and social structures that prevent people from meeting their basic needs or place them into risky situations. Teleological violence is harmful for refugees in a few ways. It amplifies the painful experience of the camp as a time and a space that's emptied of telos, or the possibility of working towards a goal, the possibility of progress. There's no momentum towards the future. Rather, it's a kind of chronic present and a grinding sense of decline. In other parts of our work, we explore how that's experienced as traumatic. Refugees are often thought of as being the victims of trauma that causes them to flee their homes, right? And that's supposed to be in the past because they reach a place of safety and protection. But they consistently described the chronic stress of the refugee camp as a kind of daily unfolding trauma, one that involves a loss of hope. For the many people we spoke to, the youth who should be in school but spend their time drinking the day away, they're emblematic of people who succumb to that trauma of empty time. So in this way, schooling in the camps is not seen as the future in the present. It's part of the endless present. It becomes one of the more onerous ways to pass the time. The other alternative is secondary migration, right? Which also puts refugees at risk. Students enrolled in college, sometimes they went missing. And when they disappeared, other students would describe to us that they had, given up. Although many college graduates do wait in the camps for years, the possibility that, they might decide to migrate is a kind of constant preoccupation. But we also found that the refugee youth we spoke with had different ways of thinking about the future, and in ways that did maintain hope, right? They were hopeful. So secondary migration is a really interesting example of that. In some ways, people talked about like giving up hope and leaving, right? Knowing the risks they faced. But that there was also some temporal agency in this, because it was a form of time making that's not really linear in the same way that schooling time is. It's a leap of faith over the near future that you have no control of to a distant future that you have to believe exists. So while the near future is just empty of hope, the distant future becomes a location for that. That either can enable people to wait a bit longer for legal migration, which you also just have to hold out hope for because of how unlikely it is, or choose to have faith that irregular migration might bring that distant future into being. So Habtom is in Germany now. His story ended well, but many others don't. And their stories prompt this critical engagement with the role that education plays as a vehicle for these integrative policies. A UNHCR report on global refugee education argues, by educating tomorrow's leaders, we're giving refugees the intellectual tools to shape the future. Education is seen as a key to attaining the goal of local integration, attached to ideas of modernity, progress, and development. And attaining this is largely described as just an issue of access. And if that's the issue, then it's easy. You build the school, right? But those empty seats in the schools in northern Ethiopia suggest that there are these bigger questions at play. What do we gain from looking at these policy paradigms temporally? As long as educational success is seen as an intrinsic good and access to education is the primary goal, the struggles of educated refugees and the harm done by education programs that inculcate impossible aspirations, they're rendered invisible. Education was one component of policies designed to deter migration, but that was a double-edged sword, extremely important to refugees who are in educational institutions. They want educational access, but also extremely painful because education powerfully forged hopes for a future, the idea of a particular kind of future, but that future in most cases was foreclosed, leaving refugees with not only a strong desire for that future, but a sense of responsibility to it for themselves, their families, their communities. They want educational opportunities, but they also want the possibility of using their educations, fulfilling those responsibilities. The other piece to this is that thinking temporally, we can see that these policies are attempting to relegate refugees to what anthropologist Shahram Khosravi describes as a kind of temporality of belatedness. So this refers to this idea that we're kind of changing refugees into developmental actors rather than kind of objects of humanitarian aid. The idea of replacing humanitarianism with development, it reinforces a global dichotomy, right, between underdeveloped countries and developed countries. And this notion that refugees belong in the underdeveloped countries, right, that are developing. It reflects the racialized security concerns of the global north. And it also risks losing sight of the mandate to protect refugees by seeing them as the subjects of developmentalism rather than as in need of humanitarian protection. Finally, it projects wishful assumptions about the stability of a place like Ethiopia and its capacity to be a long-term host of refugees. Teleological violence reveals that plans for refugee care are plans for refugee containment, potentially reinforcing lines of social difference and generating vulnerability for people. So before I conclude, I just wanted to kind of make a few comments about the war in Ethiopia that broke out after we concluded our work. Because much of this was done right up until that moment, right? And it's talking about this time period where we learn a lot about these integrative policies in Ethiopia, but stuff has changed a lot on the ground. That brand new school in Hitsat's camp, it's not even there anymore. The whole camp is not there anymore. Since our fieldwork wrapped up, things worsened exponentially. Despite great optimism when Abiy Ahmed became the new prime minister of Ethiopia and declared peace with the Eritrean government as we were concluding our fieldwork, Eritrean refugees were extremely worried that peace, that the end of the border conflict, would actually put them at risk and bring renewed conflict. After a flood of new Eritrean refugees into Ethiopia with the peace agreement, very quietly, in March 2020, the Ethiopian government revoked Eritreans' prima facie status. So that means they were given status as refugees unquestionably when they crossed the border. So that ended, and they had to undergo a status determination, and very few are getting refugee status in Ethiopia. Then in November of 2020, the war broke out in the Tigray region. Eritrean refugees, by all accounts, were targeted from all sides and subject to horrific atrocities along with the Ethiopian civilian population. The Eritrean military has been involved, forcibly taking refugees back to Eritrea. Regional militia targeted refugees as revenge for what Eritrean forces did to civilians. 2 of the camps, Hitsats and Shemelba, were destroyed. And many refugees fled the region. Some were resettled in a new camp in the neighboring Amhara region that was also described as unsafe and lacking critical supplies. Many remain in the region where deprivation of food aid has been used as a strategy of war, and the population faces severe food insecurities. So a peace agreement was signed last month, but the situation remains tense, and it's unclear if aid is reaching people. Although temporal violence cannot be equated with the horrific violence brought on by the war in northern Ethiopia, there is a link between the violence of war and the teleological violence of policies that posit Ethiopia as a viable and safe endpoint for refugees. Because refugees understood that waves of war, expulsion, and ethnic targeting had occurred repeatedly throughout the long history of Eritrean-Ethiopian relations. They didn't trust the assertion of Ethiopia's stability and therefore their own safety. And in short, they knew this could happen again, and they were right. So I thank you so much for your time and attention. I would love to take questions and talk a little bit more about this.
Chuck here with the microphone. There's Chuck. All right, so if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and Chuck will bring the microphone to you. Peter.
I'm wondering if part of the problem concerns the Ethiopians not having a lack of workers, so that if they have some free workers here, I understand that, keep them in their place, as we often do with undocumented migrants in the United States, but also in Europe, where they have a deficiency of younger generations. Integration would make there would be an incentive to immigration that there might not be in Ethiopia, and that might be part of the root of the problem of the Ethiopians being unwilling to fully integrate the refugees.
Yeah, that's such a smart question. I think certainly that's a major challenge. The economic development, there's been tremendous economic growth in Ethiopia, but it's not equally distributed. And there's a lot of unemployment. So they often have youth unemployment issues of their own, which make it challenging to integrate large populations of refugees. It's true. Yes.
So you mentioned that sometimes when they would go to school, refugee youth would have. So if there is any, if there is any fee to pay, and obviously they don't have the resources, then they wouldn't be able to pay it or other things. Were these issues, were they just experiencing them at school, or were they treated better inside the camps?
That is a really good question. Resources in the camps are never enough. They're not adequate. So no, it's not just isolated to the experience of students who are trying to do college. It follows them there. Yeah.
Your talk has made me realize the degree to which hope is embedded in the educational process. Mm-hmm. So your students at Indiana University of Pennsylvania come to you, and without it being explicit, there's hope there for the future. Mm-hmm. So is teleological violence...
Use the microphone, please.
Is teleological violence the doing away with the idea of hope?
Yeah, I think it's very much wrapped up with hope and sort of the need to have a kind of radical hope in the face of a reality that you realize you're not going to be able to attain your goals. So teleological violence, that violence is the erosion of that hope in the near future and your agency. But at the same time, people still want progress, right? They want an education. They just want to be able to do something, to move forward with it. And at the moment, it's still not possible for people.
So it's interesting that we're now all informed but it's unlikely that anybody in this room can do anything about it. Which organization could actually change this model, and do you hope that your findings would reach them so that they could modify their behavior towards refugees?
That is a great question.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I have a few responses to that.
Use the mic.
At the end of our project, there was a new refugee scholarship program that started in Italy. And it focused on Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, largely through the sort of personal efforts of an Italian scholar. That had an incredible impact on people's hope, right? That there was this pathway that they could continue their education, they could get graduate degrees, they could kind of meet those aspirations and those responsibilities. It's not really possible to do that to the US. Like, our system isn't set up that way right now, but it could be. And I think that, providing pathways for educated refugees to come and continue their education here would be incredible.
How about the UN?
There are few and far between, there are some scholarship opportunities, but I think certainly those could be expanded and grown. It'll be interesting to keep an eye on these integrative policies as they take shape in other countries. I know Kenya is moving in that direction. Uganda sort of long has been moving in that direction. So I think that this is this is not a static thing. It's very much in play. And I do think there are people with lots of goodwill attempting to make lives better, right? So having, I think, this kind of insight, and also just, starting with people is the key to creating policies that do good and that don't unwittingly do harm.
Looks like Bruce has something to say. Nope. Okay.
Before we close that.
Okay. All right. Yeah, another question? Okay.
So, and this is very, your research is very informing, and I think I have learned a lot tonight. As somebody that has done just a few research on the conflict in Tigray, because I have a dear friend of mine that is from there, do you think that after years of Ethiopia receiving so many refugees, especially from Eritrea, do you think that this kind of alliance of the Ethiopian president, if I remember well, the Ethiopian president teaming up with Eritrea to now kind of cause this conflict in Tigray, do you think that this is good on Ethiopia in the sense of I'm just thinking, after all this help that they've given to Eritrea, do you think it's fair, or do you think that there needs to be more international policies that help Ethiopia as well?
That help Ethiopia?
Yeah, because what I mean is, since the conflict is in Tigray, and Eritrea is involved in the conflict as well. Do you think that there needs to be more policies that help Ethiopia in that sense? Because they've been helping Eritrea receiving their refugees. So I believe in that sense.
So Ethiopia is really interesting, right? Because it's not just a refugee host, it produces refugees, right? People are displaced from Ethiopia and within Ethiopia in tremendous numbers. And that conflict in Tigray isn't new in those terms. Like, it's been happening in different parts of the country. It's interesting that, for this time period, Ethiopia was able to project this image as a really stable country and leverage that in particular ways, in part through this role it played as a refugee host. What things are going to look like moving forward in the wake of this conflict, hoping that it is over, I can't predict what that looks like, but I certainly know that, Eritrean troops are still present and active in the region. And, as long as that's happening, then people's well-being and ability to put the conflict behind them is not going to be possible.
Okay. Was there any more questions? No? All right, I'll have
Thank you
a.
so
Okay.
very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sue.